Hey everyone and welcome back to my channel. Today I want to do my May wrap up. I did do a reading vlog kind of throughout the month, but that was for the Asian Readathon, and I also read I think one book that wasn't for the readathon, so I thought I'd just do a kind of wrap up video where I talk about all the books I've read in May, and if you want to hear more of my thoughts on these books, you can go and check out the reading vlogs. So the first book I finished in May was Rule of Wolves, which is the second book to King of Scars in this duology. So this concludes the duology by Leroy Dugo, but this is also in the Grishaverse book series, whatever. So I would highly recommend, if you want to read this, to also read the Shadow and Bone series and the Six of Crows series, because they are all interconnected and a lot of things come back around in this book. Now in this book we follow three characters that we've met before. We have Nikolai and Zoya from the Shadow and Bone trilogy and Nina from the Six of Crows duology. And these are the three main perspectives throughout this series, but we also get a couple of other characters that we follow, sometimes for a longer period of time and sometimes for a shorter period of time. Now basically, since this is a duology that very much builds on the other series, it's hard to describe what's going on without spoiling the other series. So all I want to say is that this series focuses a lot on Zoya. And I know that in the beginning this was marketed as Nikolai's duology, but that's not what this is. But this is kind of a continuation, flashing out these characters a little bit more, and the character that definitely gets the most attention and the most development is Zoya. Now, I absolutely loved this book and gave it 5 stars because Zoya is my favorite character, and I think that her arc is amazing. I also like that we get to see so much more of the world in this duology. While the Shadow and Bone trilogy focused a lot on Ravka, and the Six of Crows duology focuses on Kirsch and Fieda, this is really like an all-round look. You get a little bit of everything in here, I feel like, even though you have the focus on Ravka again and the war with Fieda and the shoe, but I just felt like, you understood the kind of political strings so much more in this series, and that's what I loved. There are some things that I have a little bit mixed feelings about. One thing is that at the end of King of Scars there's a huge kind of surprise, kind of twist, and I felt like that was not dealt with enough in this book. I just expected way more and it just felt like kind of an afterthought in here, which I thought was very, very weird. Also, this book is a fan service. There are so many things in here that I feel like you can only appreciate if you've read and loved the whole Grishaverse so far. But yeah, it was fun for me because I did like most of it. And also, I thought that we get more information about the Grisha, where they actually came from, what their powers are, where they came from. So that's something that this book did not deliver in a way that I thought we would get. Also, I was very happy to see that we will get more Grisha books after this one. It has been announced and it's also on Goodreads, so if you want to know what the next one is, you can find that. But yeah, overall I just love this duology. It was definitely written for me and it's my favorite of the whole Grishaverse, so yeah. And I have a whole vlog uploaded dedicated to this duology, so if you're interested, I will link it at the end. Then, as I said, the Asian Readathon was happening in May, and so I tried to read mostly for that and succeeded with that. The first book I finished for that was Darius the Great Deserves Better. This is the second book to Darius the Great is Not Okay. This is a contemporary series, and you can definitely read these books on their own, even though I don't know why you would, but I really liked the first book. I think I gave that one 4 stars, and I also gave this book 4 stars. This is such a feel-good series for me. I really like the characters. I like that Darius is quite a gentle character, but he deals with a lot of harder topics, and also the people around him deal with harder topics, but just because of the way that Darius is, it doesn't feel like heavy, it doesn't drag you down, it's always this heartwarming feeling. I just really love these books. They're by Adib Khorram, I don't think I've said that already, and yeah, I just really enjoyed that. I think that this definitely felt more grown up than Darius the Great Deserves Better, because yeah, Darius goes through quite the arc in that first book and definitely comes out more as a, you know, teenage boy in the end, and you definitely feel it in the tone of the sequel. Also, it deals with his sister. He has a smaller sister, and she is like the most precious character. I love her so much. Her name is Laleh, and she's starting to get bullied in school for being of Iranian descent, and it deals with that, and it also deals with Darius having his first real boyfriend, and I thought that was interesting. You have a little bit of a love triangle going there, which you can totally tell from the cover. There were a couple of things that I did not like about the execution of that. Basically, there's one like really important topic in there, because Darius is very insecure about his body. And so he doesn't want to have sex yet, and his partner quite clearly states that sex is a part of relationships for him, so he kind of wants it, and they have this discussion overshadowing their relationship more and more, and I just felt like it could have been dealt with a little bit better, but overall I just really enjoyed this book. Also, the grandmas were so cute. It's a little bit sad because Darius doesn't have the greatest relationship with his grandparents, but he has a grandma, and I think the other grandma is called Oma, so you can kind of separate them in the head. And his one grandmother basically was born as a man, but then transitioned later on in life. And yeah, it was just so interesting, and I would love to have seen more of that. There were just very few discussions about that thrown in there where you get their story. But yeah, it was just, I don't know, I wanted more of that. I just really liked the grandmothers. They were quite fun, even though they are a bit strange, but aren't we all? So yeah, overall really enjoyed it, 4 stars for that. Next up, I finished On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous by Ocean Vuong. This is a very interesting book. As you can tell from the cover, it's not really a happy read. This follows a young man who is called Little Dog, I believe, yes. And he is the child of a single mom who came to the US from Vietnam. And this is a kind of family drama, but it also deals with being queer in America, and yeah, just it has this like small town US vibe, and then there's also these flashbacks to Vietnam during the war, which is like the most heartbreaking thing. I really enjoyed this. I think I gave it 4 stars as well. This is a book that is beautifully written, and you can totally tell that Ocean Vuong is a poet as well, because the language is so beautiful. But in some parts, I felt like the beauty of the language kind of took over and was a little bit of a hindrance for me to get the meaning of the words, if you know what I mean. Sometimes I have that I read a sentence and I think, oh, it's so beautiful, but I have no idea what it actually means. So yeah, I had some of these moments, and also I felt like I was so much more interested in the kind of family aspects and the history with the grandma and the mother who were from Vietnam. And so the parts that were about the queerness of the main character, while they were also interesting, I just had a hard time fitting them together in my head. They just felt like a little bit next to each other for me. But yeah, overall this was a very, very beautiful story, and I think a very important one as well for many people. So I would highly encourage you to pick it up. Then the next book I finished was The Almond Tree by Michelle Cohen-Corasanti. This is a book about Palestine and Israel, but written by an American Jewish woman. And so I was going into this a little bit hesitant, and I think you can definitely see where this book kind of takes a few weird turns. But I was still interested in it because my mom gave this to me years ago, and with the whole, bombing of Palestine and stuff, I felt like it was the right time to finally read this book and educate myself more, even though, the source is not the best. This basically follows a boy whose name is Ahmed, I believe. And this starts in the 1950s in Palestine, when this character, Ahmed, is still a small child, and then you follow him throughout the years until he is an old man, basically. And the main issue I had with this book was the character of Ahmed. I felt like he was always a bit detached for me. I think the most interesting part of this book, apart from like the general kind of understanding you get about how certain things work logistically, for example, the tunnels between Palestine and Egypt, which I didn't really know anything about before. But the most interesting part, apart from that, is the dynamic between Ahmed and his smaller brother, I think what is his name? I'm so bad with names. Abbas. I think Abbas is the smaller brother. And they have this very, very interesting dynamic where the bigger brother always had to be there for the family. He had to take care of the family and make sure that they have food on the table and they can build a house and stuff like that. While the smaller brother kind of had the energy and the room to kind of think beyond his own family and think about his people and about his country. And that is ultimately the kind of thing that drives the brothers apart, because they have such, they're kind of folky, their perspective is very, very different, and so they don't understand each other's decisions that well. That was the part that I was intrigued by, so I really enjoyed the ending where they actually met again as old men and discussed some of these things, but then the book was over. So the rest of the book had a couple of issues. First of all, this Palestinian boy goes to Israel to study because he's kind of a math genius, and that is something that I don't like reading about. I don't like reading about people who are like super, super duper intelligent and they're just born that way or whatever. That's just personal preference. I don't like that kind of narrative. And then also because he is in Israel, he starts working with a professor who is an Israeli. And so at first the professor is really, really mean, and he's actually trying to get him dispelled from the university. And then they are kind of forced to work together, and then they build this friendship. And the way that this was described really felt like the Palestinians have to just see the pain of the Israelis because they lost so many of their family and friends in the Holocaust. And that's why they have to show understanding and forgive them for their horrible doings. And that's just something that just doesn't sit right with me. That was just weird, and I did not like that. And so yeah, that was probably the thing that bothered me the most about this book. There were also a couple of smaller things that I mentioned in the reading vlog, but you can go and watch that. Overall, I decided to give this 3 stars because I still learned about Palestine and Israel through it, but I felt like you could definitely tell that this was not written by a Palestinian author, which is why later in the month I decided to do exactly that and read a book by a Palestinian author. But first I decided to take a bit of a break because it is quite a hard-hitting topic, and I went to read this book about Japanese myth. I think this is only a German book. It's written by Nellie Naumann, and she kind of translated some of these myths but also wrote a lot of interpretation about them. And this was such an interesting book. I think I gave it 3.5 stars in the end. Japanese myth is something that I know nothing about, so I definitely learned a lot in this book. I thought it was great that Nellie Naumann, the author, gave so many like interpretations, because the actual text is like so hard to understand and follow. Basically, you have like tons and tons of gods in this myth, and it's just really interesting the way that it is described how all of these gods kind of came to be. And so some of the gods are just they came to be because another god was cut into different pieces, and then each piece was a new god. And some of these gods came to be because some blood drips went somewhere, and yeah, there was just a lot of bodily fluids that I did not see coming. But yeah, this was so interesting, and what I liked about the kind of analyses in this book is that the author really made sure to show how these myths were used to kind of secure the power for the emperor, and how this all was kind of connected to show that the line of the emperor was actually the kind of godly chosen line to rule Japan, and that they were descendants of the sun goddess, I believe. And yeah, it was just very intriguing to learn about all of that. But also, the original texts are so hard to read nowadays because they have basically no structure that you would ever use. If people complain that the Silmarillion by Tolkien is hard to read, you have not read these texts. They are wild. But it was such an interesting experience, and I'm really glad that I've read this book now, because I had it on my shelves for so long. And yeah, I learned a lot, and it was very interesting. And then on the same day, I finished my next audiobook, which was Know My Name by Chanel Miller. You might know that this is the Emily Doe person who was sexually assaulted on Stanford campus, I believe. I'm so bad with these big university names in the US. But basically, she was assaulted by a member of that university on university grounds, and there were 2 cyclists who were also students there who kind of came across the scene and actually managed to save her for one, and then also capture the guy who assaulted her. And this book is very hard-hitting because it basically follows first the event of the assault and then everything that happened after. So all of the interviews with the police, the medical examinations, and then the whole trial. And it basically goes up until I think Trump was elected, about that time frame, a little bit longer even. So yeah, it follows a couple of years and what this assault actually did to her life. It is absolutely eloquent, which is the first thing I want to say about it. I feel like The way she structured the book is so phenomenal, because first she kind of reports what's happening, but as you get further and further into the book, she starts to reflect on it more and more and kind of guides you to certain conclusions about it that you were also able to make for yourself, because you're viewing the things first and then you get these analyses and reflections later. I don't know if that makes any sense right now because I'm not eloquent, but I just thought that this structure was really, really good, because when she would reflect on things that were always things that you had thought about yourself before, so it never felt forced. It always felt like a really, really nice flow of a thought process. And I think this is a great book if you are, especially if you're a man, because I think that a lot of women know these things and already consider a lot of these things. A lot of women are not. So, you know, I just think that usually it's women who think about these things. So I think men can really profit from this book. And I actually asked my partner to read it because we had some discussions about that before. And it's always really hard to make men understand certain things. And I think this book just does this so well that she uses examples, and really, really good examples, to make you understand. I think that I could never do it the way she does. I could never explain these things the way she does. And obviously this talks a lot about like gaslighting, a lot about, you know, the kind of different measures that we have for the actions of men and women. Because in this case, obviously both of these people were drunk, but she was assaulted and he was the one doing it, so it was his actions, and still that he was drunk was used as an excuse for him, while for her being drunk is kind of like a, I don't know how to say it in English, but it makes her less of a victim, kind of, because yeah, I'm not eloquent, I can't explain it, but please listen to this book, because it just makes so many great points. And it also talks about how race plays into it all, especially with assault cases. It talks about Trump and his loonies, and yeah, just amazing book. I gave it 5 stars. It will be on my best books of the year list. So yeah, I'm very glad that I finally listened to it. At the same time, it was very, very hard, and it definitely made me feel quite bad in some situations. And then the last book I finished last night, I have to check for the English title because it does not stick to my head. It is called The Blue Between Sky and Water by Susan Abulhava. And this is the book that I talked about that is actually written by a Palestinian author. Now this also starts in the late 40s and then follows through generations up until, I think, right before the book was written. This was finished in 2015, I believe. So it was probably written up until like 2013 or 14 probably. So yeah, this follows a family, and I loved the first part of this book because it follows a family who live in a small village in Palestine, and then in 1948 they are attacked by Israelis and they are forced to go to Gaza and live in an encampment for refugees. And this follows the sister Nasmia, who stays in that camp with her family, and then Mamdou, who is the brother who goes first to Egypt, then to Kuwait, and then to the US. And it follows their kind of families as they grow and, you know, what this situation does to them. And it focuses on a lot of things, So I loved the first part of the book, or like the first half or something, which was, you know, this intergenerational story that almost felt like homegoing, but I even like better than homegoing, because the characters that are mentioned are so unique and they're described in such a vivid way that even though you know quite little about them and you don't follow them for a lot of pages, you still feel like you know them. So this starts out with I think it's the grandma of the people I just talked about. There is a family tree somewhere. So here's the family tree. So yeah, we start out with the mother of the two people I just talked about. And she probably has schizophrenia, and she talks to a jinn. So she's kind of feared in the village, but also people think that she has a connection to God through that, which is very, very interesting. I really like the setup of this. And then this woman has three children, sorry. We have Nasmia, the sister, Mamdou, the brother, and then Mariam, the smallest sister. And it follows them during their escape from this village to Gaza and what happens there. And then, as I explained, we follow the two siblings on their different ways. Now, Nasmia has a lot of kids, and her first son gets radicalized. And then it follows her daughter, who's born last, and her children. And the brother who leaves Gaza, he has a son, and this son is brought up in the US, and so he sees a lot of Arab hate, and so he decides to kind of hide that part of himself. He doesn't speak Arabic anymore, and he doesn't feel like a Palestinian. He just rejects that identity, and so he marries a Spanish woman, and they have a child together called Nur. And we then, in the later part of the book, follow Nur as she tries to find back to her roots that were kind of cut off through her father. And that was the part that I did not enjoy though much. I wasn't that interested in Nur as a character. I also felt like she goes through some horrible shit. Like basically almost all of the trigger warnings are for her storyline. So yeah, I just sometimes have a hard time with characters that go through all of the shit. It's not that I think it's unrealistic, because there's definitely people who have to suffer these lives, but it's just something that I have a hard time connecting with in a book, because I sometimes think, you know, a little bit of shit is enough of shit, you know what I mean? So following her in the last part of the book just wasn't my favorite. I felt like she kind of took over the whole story, and I know why the author did that. It definitely makes sense, because she wants to focus on these, you know, topics of family, of your roots, of your home. But it's just not my favorite. It just brought the book down a little bit for me. So in the end, I gave it 4 stars. And as I said, this has quite some important trigger warnings. Some of these are death, war. There's some mental health representation, eating disorders that are described. There is assault of a child, sexual assault of a child, just neglect of a child, and it's also, there's some parts about the foster system in the US. So yeah, as I said, it has a lot of like really hard-hitting topics that I would advise you to stay away from if that can trigger you. Also, the way the title is in English and the way the story is told, you would think that this story is more about Khaled, who is one of the characters in the book. I don't want to spoil anything, but he seems to be kind of the narrator of the book. And I thought that the way he was handled was a bit weird to me, because he develops something that is called locked-in syndrome. I don't know anything about that, so I can't really speak to the representation in here, but he basically gets like disabled. He can't really care for himself anymore. He can't really communicate anymore. And I just felt a bit iffy about the way he was used in the end to just kind of tell the story. And yeah, I don't know. I just didn't vibe with that decision. I would have enjoyed this a lot more if this would have been more about Khaled as a character in the end and not just completely taken over by Noor. So yeah, that's my reasoning for the 4 stars. But this was still a very enjoyable and quick read. So if you are interested in Palestine and you know, you don't shy away from harder topics, then I would highly recommend this book. Also, this author just brought out a new book that I've seen going around BookTube, so maybe that would be interesting for you as well. There's only one more thing I want to mention, a book that I started in the end of May, which is A Curse of Roses. And this is actually a book inspired by medieval Portugal. And it is a fantasy and it is very good so far. It's also sapphic. So if you're interested in that, I will talk more about it in June in my reading vlog. So I wanted to give that quick little teaser there. And that's all I have today. I hope you enjoyed this video. Leave a like if you liked it and a comment if you want to. And I will talk to you soon. Bye!